What happens when a CEO goes undercover as an employee and discovers an act of kindness no one in the company has ever spoken about? Early one weekday morning, a man in a worn-out hoodie, a low-brimmed baseball cap, and faded sneakers walked into Novamart store number 7. There was nothing remarkable about him, the kind of person any employee might assume was a delivery guy, or just a regular grabbing a cheap cup of coffee. But no one knew that the man quietly pushing a shopping cart down the frozen bread aisle was Ethan Ward, the founder and CEO of the entire Novamart chain, with nearly 300 stores nationwide. For 12 years, Ethan had grown accustomed to thick reports, strategic boardroom meetings, and growth numbers often polished by layers of middle management. But in recent months, he began hearing murmurs, scattered complaints about the declining spirit of service, a coldness in customer interactions, and the absence of that human touch in stores he had once dreamed would foster community. So, he made a decision to step out of his 32nd floor office, leaving behind his advisors and PR team, and become Kyle, a temporary hire trying out a shift at the smallest store in the system. The morning passed quietly. He worked the stockroom, replaced price labels, and shelved grocery items. Everything seemed just as the reports described: smooth operations, accurate inventory, employees smiling at checkout. Ethan started to think he might have overreacted, but then it happened. Just as he turned into the cereal aisle, preparing to place a pack of oatmeal on the top shelf, he heard a young male voice from the front register say, "It's all right, sir, I've got this one today." Ethan froze for a moment, his heart skipping a beat. Peering through the aisle gap, he saw an elderly man with silver hair and a frail frame struggling to put his worn-out wallet back into his old coat pocket. The employee who had spoken was a young man named Noah, as shown on the name tag pinned to his chest, slipping a bill from his own pocket into the register drawer. No discount codes, no managerial approval, just a quiet decision made on the spot. Ethan stood still holding the oatmeal in his hand. There was no report that ever mentioned this, no KPI chart that could measure such an act. The older man looked flustered, mumbling his thanks. "Noah, you can't keep doing this." And Noah simply smiled. "I know, but if you don't eat something this morning, the whole day's going to be rough. Take care, all right?" Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a strange rhythm that wasn't anger or surprise, but awakening. Throughout the years he spent building Novamart, he always believed people were the core, but how long had it been since he'd actually seen a person live by that belief in the very empire he created? More importantly, if this happened within just 30 minutes of his first shift, how many quiet stories like this had been buried under spreadsheets and statistics? Ethan quietly returned to the cold storage room, but his mind was no longer focused on inventory counts. He had just witnessed something greater than any business strategy, and he knew he could no longer leave this place as just an observer. On the second day, Ethan returned to store number 7, still wearing the same old baseball cap pulled low over his forehead and a faded ash-gray hoodie like any ordinary worker. He arrived earlier than the day before, using the excuse that he wanted to perform well during his probation period and was assigned to assist with morning inventory. As he carried trays of frozen bread to the shelves, his eyes never strayed far from the young employee named Noah. The boy was exactly as he had been yesterday, unassuming, not overly enthusiastic, just diligent, efficient, and with an uncanny ability to remember each customer's name. A middle-aged woman walked in, barely opening her mouth before Noah greeted her. "Good morning, Miss Margie. Still grabbing gauze and soy milk today, right?" She smiled and nodded, her eyes reflecting a rare warmth in the otherwise impersonal space of a retail chain. Ethan counted silently within the first 2 hours of the morning. Noah correctly called out more than 8 customers by name, recalled their usual purchases, and sometimes even helped them find better-priced options. But it was around 11 a.m. when something happened that made Ethan's throat tighten. A young mother, pushing a worn-out stroller, placed 2 bottles of juice and a small pack of cookies on the counter. She fumbled through her wallet, pulling out a few coins, then froze when she realized she didn't have enough. Ethan stood 2 aisles away, pretending to browse mustard jars, but every sense was focused on the moment. The woman murmured, "I'll just put this one back then." Noah didn't say a word. He simply leaned slightly toward the register, slipped a $5 bill of his own into the drawer with one hand while scanning the items with the other. "It's covered, ma'am." Novomart's quietly sponsoring a smile today, he said, that same gentle smile on his face, not asking for recognition, not waiting for thanks. Ethan turned away, not wanting anyone to see the moisture forming in his eyes. What he was witnessing, had he not seen it himself, would never have appeared in a revenue report or customer behavior analysis. These were invisible moments, yet they were the very essence of what made people connect to this place, what turned a store into somewhere people felt truly seen. That entire afternoon, Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the checkout area, even while cutting price tags in the cold storage. Noah never once looked around to check if someone was watching, never played the hero, never tried to impress anyone. He simply did what he did as if it was part of who he was, as if he had grown up believing that if you can help someone stay steady a little longer, why wouldn't you? Ethan began to understand that the most valuable thing in the system he built wasn't the logistics model or hourly productivity figures, it was people like Noah, those whom no report could measure, but who silently kept the entire system alive. And what chilled him most was this: in just 2 days, he had witnessed 2 acts of quiet humanity that the entire executive board had never mentioned. How many more were being forgotten, simply because no one humble enough had been there to truly listen? During the midday shift, as everyone dispersed for a break, Ethan used the excuse of making coffee to leave the stockroom and step into the employee break room, a small space with walls covered in shift schedules and store rules, a dented microwave, and a plastic table scattered with a few leftover cookie crumbs. In the corner, Noah sat quietly, opening a paper lunchbox with the letter N scribbled on top. He wasn't scrolling TikTok, didn't have earbuds in, just texting on an old phone, the screen's glow reflecting in eyes that were both bright and tired. Ethan poured his coffee, pulled out a plastic chair, and sat beside him, still keeping the tone of a simple worker. "Busy morning, huh?" he said casually. Noah looked up and nodded. "Probably because of the pastry discount today, more people came in. But I'm used to it." Ethan took a sip of coffee, waited a few seconds, then spoke quietly, as if it slipped out naturally. "Hey, I saw you help that old man this morning, the one in the worn khaki jacket." Noah paused for a moment, then smiled, not a nervous or defensive smile, but the kind of smile that comes from someone who's grown used to explaining a kindness that should be simple. "That's Mr. Henry," he said. "He lives alone in the block behind the market, lost his wife 2 years ago, now just lives on government support. He drops by each week for a few small things. Some days he doesn't have enough, some days he forgets his wallet. I just figured, if someone's hungry and I can help, then why not? A few bucks isn't much to me, but to someone else, it might be their only meal." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He just sat there, gripping his coffee cup a little tighter, watching this young man smile softly while eating a now cold sandwich from a paper box. He, the man who had once stood in front of a board of investors passionately presenting about human-centered business operations, now felt small in front of a store employee's simple, unembellished truth. There were no grand ideals, no polished slogans, just, "If I see and I can help, then what's wrong with that?" Ethan had believed that Novomart's people-first philosophy had been internalized across all locations. But now he realized something more painful, that he, the very one who created that philosophy, hadn't lived alongside it in a long time. Noah's sincerity didn't move Ethan because of what he said, but because of how effortlessly he acted without needing recognition, without expecting anything in return. Like someone who grew up in scarcity and understood that sometimes the smallest things could be someone else's lifeline. Ethan looked at him, and for a moment he saw his own younger self, a 20-something who once hunched over in the cold storage at night, believing that if he still had kindness in him, he shouldn't wait for anyone's permission. And Ethan knew then, this story couldn't end with a quiet moment in the break room. He had to go further, but first, he needed to find out something important. Was Noah just one rare case, or were there deeper truths no one had ever dared to report? On the early morning of the 3rd day, Ethan arrived at the store before the sun had fully risen. The sky was misty, the sidewalk still carried the chill of the night air, and the warehouse lights flickered faintly like the last embers of a system struggling to keep its rhythm alive. Ethan claimed he wanted to support the opening shift, but in truth, he came to meet someone the person internal reports described as the longest-serving employee at this location, Linda Novak, 56 years old, in charge of inventory, who had been with the company for over a decade since Nova Mart was still a family-run store. Ethan's father, the former owner, once called her the living memory of the system. Linda was pushing a box toward the cold shelf when Ethan quietly stepped in to help, saying nothing. She glanced at him and gave a small nod, seemingly used to the presence of the new guy named Kyle. They worked side by side for nearly 15 minutes in silence until Ethan casually broke it. "This store feels different." Linda smiled, though it was hard to tell if it came from fondness or weariness. "Yeah, it's been different since that kid Noah came along." Ethan played the curious part. "He's been here long?" Linda paused, then replied with a voice that dropped slightly. "Not long, but long enough to leave a mark. He used to be a sophomore, good student, had a scholarship. Then his dad died in an accident, and his mom developed a heart condition. He dropped out to raise his sister, works 2 jobs. This store is the most stable thing he's got." Ethan's grip on the box handle tightened. Linda continued as if she had held these words in too long. "He's never missed a shift, never asked for anything. Anyone needs help, he shows up. But that's also why I worry about him. He keeps giving and giving. Who's looking out for him?" That last sentence stunned Ethan. No charts, no performance trackers, just the words of a warehouse worker. And he understood more deeply than any board meeting ever could. Noah wasn't just a kind young man, he was someone holding together a fragile world, silently, without asking, without expecting to be noticed. Ethan thought about the upcoming strategy meeting next week, where regional directors would present cost-cutting plans and automation proposals. No one would mention Noah. No one would factor in the way he greeted customers by name or how he gently tilted forward when handing a receipt to an elderly woman. And if Ethan hadn't been here, if he hadn't heard Linda speak with his own ears, that truth would remain a scattered memory buried beneath embellished spreadsheets. At that moment, his phone buzzed a message from his closest assistant. The audit department had received a formal complaint alleging a staff member named Noah is failing to properly record financial transactions at the register. Ethan read the message, and a chill spread through his chest. Anonymous. Someone was trying to remove Noah from the system, and if that happened, everything beautiful he had just witnessed would be buried under an administrative signature. He gripped the phone tighter, his heart roiling. This was no longer the story of a kind employee. This was the moment he had to step out of the shadows and overhaul everything about how this system was being run. That evening, store number 7 closed right on time as usual. Employees clocked out, a few stayed behind for inventory, and the dim light in the break room cast its usual glow over the round plastic table where people often ate lunch, rushed their meals, then dove back into the relentless rhythm of retail. But today, something unusual happened. The store manager suddenly announced, "Everyone, please stay for a few minutes. There's an urgent message from headquarters." The room stirred. Noah stood in the corner, folding his apron while joking with the cashier beside him. He had no idea that everything behind him was about to change. Ethan walked in from the back. No cap, no hoodie. Just a simple white button-down shirt, his hair neatly combed, his eyes calm as they swept across the room. A sudden silence fell. No one knew what was happening, but the air grew heavy in an instant. Ethan stood at the center and spoke, his voice low but clear. "Good evening, everyone. I'm not Kyle, and I'm not a temp worker. I'm Ethan Ward, founder and CEO of Nova Mart." Someone dropped a water bottle. A few stared so wide-eyed they forgot to blink, and all eyes, almost instinctively, turned toward Noah. Only he remained still, unable to process what was unfolding. Ethan looked at him, not with the gaze of an observer this time, but with the eyes of a man reminded of what it means to be kind without needing recognition. He drew a breath, then continued. I've worked alongside you for the past 3 days, not to evaluate, not because I doubted you, but because I wanted to know whether the philosophy my father and I built this company on, people first, still lives. And I found the answer. Ethan stepped closer to Noah, his voice softening. Noah, I saw you helping people no one asked you to help. I saw you remembering every customer's name, knowing the medicine Miss Margie usually buys, recognizing the days Mr. Henry falls short, and never letting him feel small. I learned your story about leaving college, raising your sister, working 2 shifts without missing a single day. And still, you choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. No one spoke. No one even breathed loudly. Then Ethan raised his voice. So today, I'm making 3 announcements. First, every staff member at this store will receive a bonus equal to 1 month's salary. Not because of profit margins, but because you've preserved the soul of this company. Second, Noah, starting tomorrow, you are being promoted to shift manager. I will also personally fund your sister's full college tuition until the day she graduates. A sharp gasp came from the back of the room, then burst into applause. Some people cried. Others just stood frozen in disbelief. But Noah remained still, hands clenched, eyes welling up. Ethan looked at him again, voice lowering. And finally, I'm announcing a new internal fund, the Noah Fund, to support any employee facing hardship, just as you've supported others, quietly, without asking for anything in return. Noah took a step forward, still silent. He seemed to swallow every emotion, until Ethan looked him straight in the eye and said, "You asked for nothing, so you deserve everything." The room erupted in applause, not because of the promotion, but because in that moment everyone knew they had just witnessed something real. Kindness, when given to the right person, can transform an entire system. And Ethan understood then that he wasn't just leading a retail chain anymore, he was beginning to rewrite what it means to lead as a human being. Just one night later, the HR department at Novamart's headquarters received dozens of unexpected emails. Not resignation letters, not the usual complaints, but sincere emotional messages from branches across the country. An employee in Iowa shared how she once paid for gas for an elderly man who had gotten lost. A manager in Colorado confessed he had taken unpaid leave to take a warehouse employee to the doctor because the man had no health insurance. A sales associate in Mississippi revealed she often brought homemade sandwiches for a homeless man who sat on the store's steps every morning. None of these acts had ever been recorded. There were no KPIs to measure them, no cameras to document them. But now, as Noah's story spread from an internal blog post that was shared over 200,000 times in just 3 days, hearts once hardened by the mechanics of retail began to stir. A local newspaper called Noah the cashier who reignited corporate culture, and a national TV station ran a short segment on Sunday morning that moved viewers across the country. But Ethan didn't rush to turn this into a marketing campaign. He was careful not to let Noah's name become a label to be slapped onto product packaging. He understood that when too many lights are cast on something that began in silence, it risks losing its essence. Instead, he quietly activated the Noah Fund, a support program for Novamart employees in hardship, run purely on human trust. There were no 3-page applications, no signatures required from 4 levels of management. Any employee could nominate a colleague in need. And then, the stories began to arrive. An employee in Ohio proposed using the fund to help a friend who had just given birth and was in debt from medical complications. A group in Arizona wanted to buy a bicycle for a new night shift employee who had been walking 7 miles to work every day for 6 months without a word of complaint. Each story was a thread, and when woven together, formed a network that made Ethan realize this company wasn't held together by profit margins or growth projections, but by people quietly caring for one another. At the first regional meeting following the event at store number 7, Ethan didn't start with slides. He didn't talk about quarterly growth or mention plans for market expansion. He simply retold the moment behind the cereal aisle when he saw a young employee slip his own money into the register so a customer could have breakfast. And then he asked, In your region, is there someone like Noah? Not to find another Noah, but to seek out that same spirit, the kind that no paycheck can produce, yet is the most valuable asset any organization can possess. Ethan understood then that sometimes what keeps a system alive isn't a new strategy, but remembering why it all began. Noah began his role as shift manager the following week. But unlike others who had been promoted before, he didn't change his behavior in the slightest. He still arrived earlier than everyone else, still restocked each shelf of unsweetened almond milk, still asked every new employee if they had slept well and whether their shoes were hurting their feet. He didn't rush to delegate tasks or push for speed. Instead, he spent time quietly observing, trying to understand who was the one that spoke little but carried the most, who was the one that smiled often but hid tears after shifts. Noah didn't lead with organizational charts. He led with presence, and that presence began to change the atmosphere of the store. There were no more mid-shift sighs, no more remarks like, "That's not my job." One employee who used to snap after customers returned items 3 times in a day unexpectedly bowed his head and apologized to Noah, saying he realized he'd been petty. Another young new hire, who once complained about being forced to smile fake smiles, whispered after a week working alongside Noah, "I realized I don't have to fake it if I truly mean it." No meeting had asked for this. No internal policy had mandated kindness. But because of Noah, people began to recalibrate themselves, as if kindness had a ripple effect, and one person patient enough could reach the hearts of an entire team. Noah started thinking further, not about climbing higher ranks, but about newcomers, how to make sure they didn't feel lost during their first days. He created a small group chat where people shared little joyful moments from their shifts, from customers handing out candy to stories of a lost puppy being returned. He handwrote thank you cards after every busy holiday season, so that those working in storage, at the counter, or behind the scenes would know their efforts weren't forgotten. Once, upon learning that an older female employee had recently lost her husband, he quietly organized a surprise birthday gathering, no flowery words, just a homemade cake and a group photo with a simple caption, "Here, you are not alone." None of this required a big budget or upper management approval. It just took someone perceptive enough to notice and sincere enough to act. Ethan knew what was happening. He didn't interfere. He didn't supervise. He simply returned to the store one afternoon in March, this time without a disguise. He stood by the bakery counter, coffee in hand, watching as Noah sat beside an 18-year-old on their first day. Noah didn't talk about procedures. He didn't intimidate with company rules. He simply asked, "Are you doing okay today? Is there anything making you feel out of place?" And then he listened, genuinely. Ethan stood still. In all his years of leading, he had learned to make fast decisions, analyze cold data, and rigorously control costs. But no one had ever taught him that listening, when done with sincerity, was the most powerful leadership skill. And that kindness, when practiced consistently, isn't a weakness. It is the strongest adhesive holding an organization together from the inside out. 1 year after Ethan stepped into store number 7 disguised as an ordinary employee, the Novamart system had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Employee turnover dropped sharply, customer satisfaction steadily climbed, but more importantly, conversations began to shift. People started mentioning the Noah spirit, not as a slogan imposed from above, but as a quiet reminder that anyone, in any position, could make a difference through a single act of kindness. No title needed, no accolades required, just the ability to see someone else and not turn away. Noah was invited to speak at Novamart's national conference. The room was filled with regional directors and senior executives, people who had long believed only in charts and ROI figures. But when he stepped up, gripping the microphone with a slight tremble, every whisper in the room fell silent. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Noah began, his voice not smooth, but sincere. "I always thought of myself as just a store clerk, finishing shifts and going home. But I realized, you don't have to do something big to make something better. A glass of water, a simple question like, "Are you doing okay today?" If each of us did one small thing every day, this store, and maybe even the world, would feel a little lighter. When he finished, the entire auditorium rose to their feet, not because the speech was polished, but because they had just witnessed something rare, a human being truly living out the kindness within them, without performance. The very next day, a sociology student emailed Noah, "I'm writing my thesis on informal positive influence within organizations, and I chose you as my subject." Noah simply replied, "I didn't do anything big. I just couldn't look away when someone else was struggling." One afternoon during his shift, a boy around 10 years old came up to the register with his mom. When Noah handed back the change, the boy leaned in and whispered, "Are you the Noah from the video?" Noah smiled and nodded gently. The boy's eyes lit up. "I want to do good things like you when I grow up." Noah crouched to meet him at eye level, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said softly, "You don't have to wait until you're grown. You can start today." Ethan overheard the moment from a few feet away. He stood frozen, because he knew that in a world full of noise and chaos, trust often begins with something this simple. Ethan never pushed Noah to become a regional director, even though the board of trustees suggested it, because Noah had once told him something Ethan could never forget. "If I leave this store, I won't be myself anymore." Not everyone defines success by climbing higher. Some just want to stay exactly where they belong, and from that place, lift others up. Novamart didn't rewrite its corporate philosophy. They simply added one line to the new employee training manual. Any place can have a Noah if you're willing to listen, notice, and not overlook the small things. A year later, at a national leadership forum, Ethan was invited to speak as an inspiring CEO. But he didn't talk about revenue or market expansion. He just told a story about one morning by the cereal aisle where he watched a young man quietly slip his own money into the register so a customer could leave with peace of mind. "I used to think my job was to lead," Ethan concluded, his voice dropping. "But now I understand the real job is to create space where others can lead through action, not title." As he stepped off stage, Ethan didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, to awaken an entire system, all it takes is one person who refuses to look away from someone else's pain. One person like Noah. In today's corporate world, where performance and numbers often overshadow human emotions, it is the small, sincere acts that make the biggest difference. Noah's story didn't just change one store. It made an entire system reflect on how we treat one another. Because sometimes, leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about knowing how to listen. If you believe that kindness deserves to be shared, hit like and subscribe so we can continue telling stories that matter. And don't forget to leave a comment with the words, "Choose kindness," if you believe that even the smallest act of compassion still carries meaning.